Everybody, we're about to begin Session 11, Breach of International Law, Ukraine, Gaza, and Kashmir, which will be moderated by Saroop Ijaz, Senior Counsel, Asia Division of Human Rights Watch, Pakistan, in conversation with Ken Roth, Attorney and former Director of Human Rights Watch, United States of America.
Thank you, Eliza. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. And as you've seen, the session had two panelists to begin with, but now we've decided that, on international law, a conversation with Roth, I think, suffices for any session. So I'll begin by virtue of a very brief introduction for Ken. Ken had been the Executive Director for Human Rights Watch for nearly 30 years. He transformed Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Watch under his stewardship and leadership has become the largest human rights organization in the world. It's an organization that now works in over 100 countries. Ken has also been my longtime boss. And in many ways, at the risk of embarrassing Ken, I think Ken has been one of the most significant figures of the 21st century, in the past 25 years, of how we now look and understand human rights law and the international human rights framework. The subject of our conversation today is the breach of international law or the future of international law. We are living in a time where there are obituaries for the demise of international law being written every day. There is this growing sentiment, perception, opinion that international law is either no longer effective, is no longer relevant, it's on its way down. And related to that is, of course, in the international human rights law. So I will begin by asking Ken about starting with the big question itself, which is that there seems to be now this growing opinion, where the limitations of international law, the view is that how the international law regime, and also the international human rights law regime, as we understand, how it was developed post the Second World War. The idea that, and to concretize this example, after the Holocaust, this entire thing that, a mass atrocity like this will never happen again, and that this, in many ways, that informed the international law regime. But as we speak today, one concrete example is that not only we've seen a genocide, not only has genocide happened in Darfur, we've seen Rwanda, but for the past nearly 3 years, what we've now seen is a genocide in Gaza, which was broadcasted live, which was live tweeted. And that has led to the question of the relevance and the effectiveness of international law. And there are other examples, of course, Ukraine. So I'll start off with that.
Okay, well, Saroop, thank you for joining me up here. Thanks to the organizers at this conference. I was a longtime collaborator and great admirer of Asma. I was very fortunate to be able to work with her repeatedly, and it's an honor for me to be able to speak here at this conference in her memory. Saroop, in response to your question, there certainly is no doubt that this is a dire time for international human rights and humanitarian law. There are blatant violations going on in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Eastern Congo. And you note that, you say Gaza, that this was a genocide that was televised. True. But if you look at sort of the prior genocides since the Holocaust, it's not that we didn't know. We knew about the Rwandan genocide, we knew about the genocides in Bosnia, in Darfur, it wasn't a lack of knowledge that was our problem, it was a lack of will to stop them. So, Gaza is an egregious example of a genocide that not only was ignored, but was actually aided and abetted by the US government, which funneled massive arms and billions of dollars to the Israeli government as it was committing genocide. So, we have a big problem here. But does this represent the demise of the law? And I think to answer that question, let me bring it to a domestic analogy. If somebody commits a murder outside, somebody shoots someone else, is that a crime or is that the end of the criminal law? Now, the answer to that really depends on the response of the authorities. If the authorities say, this is horrible, we're going to investigate this murder, we're going to arrest the suspect, we're going to prosecute him, that reaffirms the law at the moment that it was violated. But if the authorities say, we never liked this guy, we're just as happy to have him dead, that represents, an acceptance of the violation of the law, and that is the beginning of the end of the law. So I think the question we have to ask is, what has been the international response to these mass atrocities in places like Gaza and Ukraine? And this is where I actually am more heartened than those who say that this is the end of the law. Because the international response has actually been quite firm in response to these situations. If you look at Gaza, the UN Security Council has done nothing because of the US veto, but the UN General Assembly, the UN Human Rights Council, places where there is no veto, they have repeatedly condemned the atrocities. They have decried the genocide. The Human Rights Council has created monitoring mechanisms that have reported on and criticized these atrocities. The International Criminal Court has charged Netanyahu and the former defense minister Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity for the starvation of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. There has been, the International Court of Justice, which is hearing South Africa's genocide case. It has ordered Israel to end the illegal occupation. These are strong responses. These are affirmations of the law. Now, standing against that, of course, we have the Trump administration that has imposed sanctions on the ICC. Trump continues to funnel money and arms to the Israeli government. So I recognize that it's a mixed bag, but I don't minimize what has really been, global outrage and condemnation of Israel's conduct. And for me, as Israel rips up the rules, as it blatantly violates international law, most others are reaffirming the law. And you can say the same thing about Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Again, the UN Security Council has been worthless, in this case because of Russia's veto. But the UN General Assembly has repeatedly condemned what's happened. So has the UN Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council set up monitoring mechanisms both for war crimes in Ukraine and repression in Russia. There have been intense sanctions regimes imposed by many governments on Russia to try to end the war crimes. There are exceptions to this. China continues to purchase Russian oil, which basically funds, underwrites the war crimes in Ukraine. But, despite it not being perfect, I again see a strong affirmation of the law. And if you look at, around the world elsewhere, I won't get into as much detail, but in Sudan and in Eastern Congo, there have been, broad condemnations of the genocide that the Rapid Support Forces are committing in Sudan. There's been broad condemnation of Rwanda's invasion of Eastern Congo and the war crimes it's committing through its M23 rebel group. There we don't yet have charges from the International Criminal Court the way we do with, say, Putin or with Netanyahu, but we do have investigations launched. I'm disappointed that there's been too little willingness to call out the role of the United Arab Emirates for arming the genocide in Darfur, that there has been too little condemnation of Rwanda for invading its neighbor. But again, we see enough action to uphold the law that, when I look at this kind of global spectrum, I do see challenges. I see, very serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, but I don't see the world abandoning that law. And with the exceptions, there's Trump, there's Xi Jinping, but most of the world says that these are mass atrocities that are wrong, that are illegal. And therefore, I take heart from that reaction even as we face such serious violations.
Thank you. I think a related question, and a segue from what you just said, one criticism, one question was that the force of the international law, of international human rights law, was, as it has developed in the past 7 decades, was a large part of it was on the assumption that there would be a willingness by certain sort of powerful governments to push for it, right? And now you give the example of Trump and the other examples now. And when you lose that sort of, right, it was, you'd have mostly sort of Western powerful countries, but a big sort of powerful influential government would be willing to push for it. And that presupposed sort of some kind of a rights-based consensus within those countries and have those governments that push for it. And at this moment of sort of populism, an ascendant populism, or some would argue the decline of liberal democracy. So domestic institutions in those countries who would traditionally push for human rights around the world. I think, so how do you see that? Because there was this reliance, right? And what happens when, and that's, a lot of the world is finding out sort of what happens when you have Trump in the US, and you certainly have lost that leverage, for example, or that lever. Was that a good strategy to begin with for or was it just the inevitable strategy for human rights advocacy or enforcement around the world?
Yeah. Look, I think there's no alternative but to look to democracies as your primary defender of human rights. I wouldn't say just Western democracies. Latin American democracies, democracies in Africa, parts of Asia have also been important supporters. But, I think we have to recognize that the US government, today is an opponent of the enforcement of human rights. But this is not the first time this has happened. If you look back to, say, the George W. Bush administration, it in many ways was worse than Trump. Trump, yes, he just invaded Venezuela, he's bombing Iran, but, George W. Bush was, detaining people, throwing them in secret CIA detention centers, subjecting them to systematic torture, putting hundreds of people in Guantanamo for endless detention. These were serious violations that the US government was committing. And so, of course it was against efforts to uphold human rights. And this is, part of, I think, a tendency we've seen in Washington over many, many years, many administrations, Republican as well as Democratic, to try to exempt the United States from international law. That has been an obstacle, but not an impediment. We've been able to surmount that opposition from Washington repeatedly. And let me give an example. When, in 1998, we were negotiating for the creation of the International Criminal Court, the US government under Clinton, so a Democratic president, adamantly opposed any court that could theoretically prosecute an American. And our view was, that's not justice. Justice has got to be universal. It has to apply any place. And so there was a huge battle. The treaty, the Rome Treaty that came out, was allowed for so-called territorial jurisdiction, meaning that if a crime is committed on the territory of a state that has joined the ICC, then any perpetrator of any nationality can be prosecuted. That's how Netanyahu is being prosecuted today for crimes being committed in Palestine. That's how Putin is prosecuted for crimes in Ukraine. Even though Israel and Russia are not members, Palestine and Ukraine are. How did we get there? We put together a coalition of 60 governments from around the world that together had the moral and political clout to stand up to the superpowers, to stand up to opposition, not only from Washington, but also from Moscow and Beijing. And in those circumstances, you didn't need the superpowers. There was enough clout every place else to uphold human rights. I'll give another example. Under the first Trump administration, there is no way you could go to him to uphold human rights. So we again had to build coalitions, and we had a series of successes. For example, we were able to create, through the UN Human Rights Council, a monitoring mechanism to look at the Saudi-led coalition's bombing of civilians in Yemen, a body that existed for 4 years and made a big difference in reducing the death toll. We were able to work with France, Germany, and Turkey to get Putin to stop bombing civilians in Idlib province in Syria. Iceland, which actually took the seat of the United States at the UN Human Rights Council, led an effort to monitor Duterte's summary executions of drug suspects in the Philippines, murders that he is now in The Hague for awaiting trial before the International Criminal Court. So these are all efforts, without the United States, often despite opposition from the United States. So we shouldn't get disheartened by the fact that Trump is today an opponent of the enforcement of human rights. There are ways to go forward. Now, I wish Europe, in particular, was stronger. Today, at least until this whole Greenland fiasco, Europe was into placating Trump rather than standing up to him. They were worried about keeping him engaged on Ukraine until I think they learned that fawning over Trump doesn't impress him. He admires only strength. And so when they began threatening back with serious economic consequences, he backed off of Greenland, and he still is engaged on Ukraine. So I'd like to see a stronger defense of human rights by the Europeans, who traditionally have been a key part of the backbone we need to stand up to Washington. But this is a very doable proposition if we look historically, and I think if we get the right coalition together, we can continue to defend human rights despite the hostile environment that exists in certain capitals around the world.
Well, thank you. I think leading up to following up on the thread of domestic institutions, you said it's natural. There's no other option to look but to look at democracies, and to look at the domestic institutions to get a coalition of democracies together, basically. But also for the international human rights model, it was, to plug in a Human Rights Watch sort of tagline, it was investigate, expose, and change. And that's, the idea is that if you spotlight human rights violations, if you spotlight bad behavior, there would be condemnation that would come from that, and there would be reputational damage that would accrue because of that, and that would lead the government, the bad actor, to change or modify their behavior. And that model, by and large, works. But now we're also seeing, arguably, limits of that model. What happens when you spotlight a government's bad behavior, and instead of condemnation, the public stands up and applaud, right? It's not, there is no sort of, or they don't care enough. And we've seen sort of, even in the past day and a half, we've seen language being borrowed from, let's say, Trump's immigration policy and deployed in domestic context. I said, so, but so what happens when you talk about sort of the traditional naming and shaming model of spotlighting bad behavior, and it starts a cycle, condemnation, reputational damage, change bad behavior, if condemnation doesn't come?
No, I think that has been a particular problem these days on the issue of migration. And many of the populists that are emerging in different democracies around the world are pursuing an anti-immigrant agenda. And they're blaming immigrants for all kinds of economic woes or for cultural challenges. And that, for example, is how Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been successful for so long. That's a big part of Trump's appeal. That's the appeal of Nigel Farage in the UK, or Marine Le Pen in France, or the AfD in Germany. Now, I think there are limits to this approach. I mean, if you just, say you're being anti-immigrant, they don't care. They get applause for that. But if we look at sort of what Trump is doing in the United States right now, you can go too far. Trump, I think, did have a mandate to stop the millions of people who were crossing the US-Mexican border. The American people thought that had just become too much. But what Trump didn't have a mandate to do is to have these immigration raids in cities across the country where he was pretty much randomly picking up undocumented immigrants. And one thing to know about undocumented immigrants in the United States is that something like 80% of them have been in the country for 5 years or more. Well over a majority have been there for a decade or more. That means that these people have US citizen spouses, US citizen children, they have jobs, they pay taxes, they're members of the community. They basically are Americans in all but the papers that they carry. And it turns out it's not popular to randomly pick these people up and deport them, because you end up deporting people's neighbor or people's, workplace companion. And of course it's not popular when we see what happened in Minneapolis over the last month, where Trump's deportation agents have, summarily executed 2 protesters on video. So it is possible to go too far. And we've seen, Trump's popularity is plummeting in the United States. Viktor Orban is facing a big electoral challenge by Peter Magyar in May. And if you look at the polls right now, he's likely to lose. So, there is a limit. I think we have to recognize governments do have the right to control immigration. They don't have the right to treat people arbitrarily, to send people back to persecution, to use violence. And so I think there are areas where the shaming is still very powerful, as we've seen just most recently in Minneapolis.
Absolutely. I think I agree that shaming remains the primary tool, if not one of the major ones. But I think circling back to from where we started, which is in a nutshell, the charge against international law in general, and sometimes against international human rights law, but against international law, which is the charge of double standards, right? So you gave the example. If somebody gets murdered, how do the authorities respond? And one is the authorities respond by saying to the murderers, fine, we don't care, and that means the law stands abolished. But the other is that they act differently for different actors, right? And that's, I think, again, we've talked about Gaza, with Ukraine, we've talked about Venezuela recently. And what that means, I think, or how it's deployed or weaponized. Firstly, sometimes they are double standards. The second, it's weaponized, is saying that, we won't, so other states saying that we won't conform with international law because we are only being made to conform to it because we do not have the power to exempt ourselves from it. So, the heightened example of it is the UN Security Council veto. But beyond that, there are tiers of that, right? They're saying that, so this idea that we have to play by international law norms up to the point that we become big and powerful enough to exempt ourselves from it. And what that means is it brings sort of a normative challenge, which is even if there are states which are complying with international law, they're complying with it for reasons that they cannot opt out of it. But the escalation is to opt out of it. How does one look? How do you look at this? The accusation or criticism against international law of double standards, which is now also in the past few years we're seeing it becoming more acute or more amplified.
Yeah, Saroop, you're totally right to point out that when there are these double standards, when there are inconsistencies in how particularly the major powers apply international human rights law, that weakens the law. We shouldn't pretend that this just began now. I started doing human rights work in the middle of the Cold War, which was filled with double standards. If you're in the West, and if you were an anti-communist force, the West tended to overlook your human rights violations. If you were a pro-Soviet force, you were condemned. And then the reverse was true on the Soviet side. So, this has been a problem throughout. One thing I was always very proud of at Human Rights Watch is that we tried to apply the same standards to everybody. And, it can be very short-sighted to try to exempt certain governments from human rights law. I look at what just recently happened around Venezuela. So, Trump's invasion of Venezuela to seize Maduro was a blatant violation of international law. There was no UN Security Council resolution of authorizing this. There was no plausible claim of self-defense. This was just an invasion. It was aggression. It was a violation of international law. Now, when that happened, if you look at the European governments, they didn't say very much. Why didn't they say very much? Because they wanted to keep Trump on board for Ukraine. Now, it's hard to do that because, the same law that makes it an act of aggression for Putin to invade Ukraine is what makes it an act of aggression for Trump to invade Venezuela. It's the same law, So when you start picking and choosing, you do weaken the law. And Europe very quickly learned a lesson because Trump, having been emboldened by his invasion of Venezuela, suddenly decided he wanted Greenland. And then Europe said, wait a minute, that's a step too far. That's us. You're taking over our territory. And suddenly, European leaders found their backbone, which, to me, illustrates the problem of tolerating a double standard. It can come back to haunt you. And so I think that the best approach is to not tolerate the double standard. To recognize that, of course, the major powers always try to exempt themselves. That's kind of the nature of power. But all of us have the capacity to push back. And if there's enough heat, the major power backs off. Trump retreated from Davos, his, tail in his hands, and gave up on Greenland. So it is, there can be effective responses to this tendency of the major powers to exempt themselves from the law.
Absolutely. I agree. But I think going back in time, when we talk about one criticism on the international human rights law or the human rights framework, which is now particularly, I think, more recently gaining currency. Not all of that, I think, is driven by good faith, but still, it is that when the international human rights law regime, as we know it now, developed, there was this sort of a prioritization of a categorization where there's a tier 1 of civil and political rights and there's tier 2 of economic, social, and cultural rights. That's how the criticism goes. And that's the language of the law as well. There's progressive realization, and then there's civil and political rights, etc. And now what we see more and more people saying that, what we do is, and we see governments not driven by good faith always. They say, if you wanted to work, on rights, we let you work on right to health because that's what people want, right? That's concrete. And we've seen that here, and we've seen with other countries as well. With right to education, yeah, that's real. But freedom of expression is abstract. You and I don't agree on what it is. Let's work on. But so there was always that kind of thing which came from sort of not a place of good faith. But now there's also this idea that, because it was the ICCPR, the ICSCR, because they were products of, coincided with the Cold War at that time. So you see a prioritization between these two tiers, and I think that has increasingly becoming this debate on sort of in the global south, but around the world, right? It's at an acute level, it's phrased in sort of polemical sloganeering as the international human rights law is neo-colonialism. None of that is in good faith. But How do you look at that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the proper way to look at it is, the way the Universal Declaration for Human Rights is written, which is that all the rights are together. They're all co-equal. Civil and political are right there with economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, you're right, Saroop, that there has been this politicization of this debate going back to the Cold War, where the West said we're going to prioritize civil and political rights, and the Soviets said we're going to prioritize economic and social rights. And the two were deemed sort of somehow ideologically in competition. I think that's a mistake, because you do really need both together. That of course people need healthcare and education and housing, and if you don't have that, it's hard to worry about things like free media or free expression. But at the same time, if you don't have accountable government, that is to say, if you don't have people who are able to organize political parties, if you don't have free media that is able to monitor and challenge governmental misconduct, if you don't allow people to speak out about what the government is doing, to organize and to protest, you then have governments that quickly begin to serve themselves. That's what autocracies are about. And when governments serve themselves rather than their people, the money needed for healthcare and education and housing disappears. It goes into their Swiss bank accounts. It goes into vanity projects. It goes into needlessly building up the military. And you can see example after example of this. I mean, take Egypt today. President Sisi is putting vast resources into this vanity project, a new administrative capital outside of Cairo. Nobody needs it, but it's a boondoggle for the Egyptian military, which is his main backer, because they control all the construction projects. And so while the Egyptian people are struggling to purchase bread, there's real poverty in Egypt. All the money is going to this corrupt vanity project supported by the Egyptian military. And that's what happens when there is no civil society, because Sisi has shut down the independent media. He shut down the human rights groups. He doesn't allow public protests. And I think we can look at that over and over and over again. Look at Venezuela. Forget the Trump invasion right now, just while Maduro was in power still. Venezuela used to be a rich country. It has the largest oil reserves in the world. In the last decade, it shed 8 million refugees, a huge percentage of the country, because it was impoverished. How can a rich country become so impoverished? Because it was being run by an autocrat who steered the money to himself and his cronies to stay in power and abandon the Venezuelan people. And you can just go through account after account of this. Every once in a while, there is an exception. There's a Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. There's an autocrat who is able to govern without political freedoms and still lead to economic development. But that is a rare exception. I mean, if you had to kind of bet where do you want to be, do you want to live in an autocracy or democracy, you'd have to be out of your mind to choose the autocracy, because you're much more likely to be impoverished. And even China, which is obviously kind of the classic autocracy, they have been able to make significant economic progress, but much less than their democratic neighbors. China has still not escaped the middle income trap, unlike Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, neighbors that as democracies are now basically wealthy territories or countries, whereas China isn't. And if you start looking at why, a lot of it is because of the self-serving policies of the autocratic leadership in Beijing. The one-child policy imposed on the Chinese people has led to this huge demographic crisis today. The huge housing problem is because the central government was controlling housing rather than allowing kind of a freer system. Xi Jinping has attacked a lot of the tech giants because he feared that they were more powerful than he was, even at the expense of the Chinese economy. And you can just go through case after case. When you have somebody who is unaccountable to their people, they serve themselves, not the people, and that is not how economies flourish.
Thank you. I think It's a great answer. I think on that, the link between civil and political rights and economic and social rights, it's, I think it was Amartya Sen's work on the Bengal famine, and one of the, I'm being reductionist here, was that, a functioning democracy wouldn't have a famine because you wouldn't have a famine. You could have an earthquake, but you wouldn't have a famine because there would be enough sort of public accountability mechanism to stop that. And I think, but maybe related to my previous question was, and this is not a new phenomenon, I think it's heightened right now. It is the idea that, of cultural relativism, right? And you started with the UDHR, the rights are universal, they're indivisible, they're unalienable. And they said, no, but society X views freedom of expression differently from society Y, right? That's a lot of what we're seeing right now. So we are seeing that, civil and political rights can be subjugated if you have economic and social rights. It's a false binary, as you very sort of eloquently laid that out. But now there's another thing, it's always been there, but we're now seeing more and more coming from states across the world, is that, well, we don't have the Western view on freedom of expression. We don't, and that's the, the cultural relativism idea, right? You believe in freedom of expression. The US has a First Amendment freedom of expression threshold. And if we allow it here in this country, in the global south, that should lead to utter mayhem and chaos and people to sort of kill themselves, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you address that?
Yeah. No, I hear this all the time, that human rights are really just a cultural imposition. You hear this from governments, I should say. You don't hear it from people so often. And let me try to narrow that first of all. I've traveled the world because of my work. I have never met somebody who wants to be summarily executed. I've never met somebody who wants to be tortured, who wants to be imprisoned for their political views, or discriminated against because of their ethnicity or their race, or thrown in prison arbitrarily. I've never met somebody who wants to be denied housing or health care or education. Okay, these are universal desires. The idea that these are imposed on people, please, do you feel imposed upon because you can't be summarily executed? So let's get real here. Now, where this typically comes up in a more contested area is around something like women's rights or LGBT rights or religious freedom. And there clearly are cultural differences, but let's be clear about what the imposition is. The prior panel here was about the Taliban. Okay, so if you're an Afghan woman, what's the imposition here? Is the West imposing on you a desire to have a free life, the ability to go to school, the ability to have a job? Are those Western impositions? Or is the imposition the Taliban that says you can't have those things? And that's why I say that these arguments of imposition are almost always by the government. If you talk to the people of these countries, they want their freedoms. Now, if you are an Afghan woman and you say, oh, but I want to lead a sequestered life, I want to wear the burqa, I want to have my husband control my life, fine. Nobody's going to stop you. That's your choice. But if you're an Afghan woman who wants to have an education, who wants to have a career, who wants to be able to walk openly, to lead a normal life, the only imposition is when the Taliban says you can't do that. So we have to be very clear here that this concept of human rights being a cultural imposition is not the way most people feel it. This is an excuse that governments offer to justify their repression.
Yeah, this is a great answer. And I think it's important for this to be laid out in these terms, because and it's an important distinction that this comes from governments and not the people. So I think now, and I'll open it up to questions to the audience very soon, but stepping back on the entire international law framework, I think one thing, and again, Trump is one example of it, but there are but it's because it's the most spectacular example of it. I think the bureaucracy of international law, the UN, and everything that comes with it. We heard about the aid cuts and the disastrous impact it's having in Afghanistan, but also around the world. So the reliance of how the UN system has evolved, right? And it takes one bad election in one of the major superpowers for the entire global bureaucracy of international law to be upended. Is that just inevitable, or is there some kind of a different conception possible?
Yeah, I mean, on the financing side, I'm not sure what the alternative is to the United Nations relying on governmental funding. And when you have a lawless regime, as in Washington, yes, it has consequences. But when we look at the United Nations, I mean, I think it's useful to think of the United Nations in two parts. One is there's the part of the United Nations where it's operational. They do development work, they feed people, they provide health care, and these huge international agencies are run by individuals who may or may not be good leaders, and we have to examine that. The other part of the United Nations is basically a conference room. It's where governments meet. So you can't criticize the United Nations, they're just the landlord. You got to criticize the governments that show up and use the meeting halls. So let's look at the moment how those are both doing. I mean, when the UN is a meeting hall, the Security Council's been a disaster because of the veto. And the only good thing from Trump's Board of Peace is there's no veto other than Trump, so it's not really an improvement. But, anything that would get rid of the veto would be good. But, if you look at the General Assembly, and foremost if you look at the Human Rights Council, it works reasonably well. I mean, we don't win everything we want, but the Human Rights Council has been, very effective on serious situation after serious situation, including Afghanistan, including Myanmar, Ukraine, Gaza, etc. So it's a place where, we get condemnations, we get investigative mechanisms launched, powerful reports emerge. Richard Bennett here is, a product of that same body who's been reporting excellently on Afghanistan. So, that part isn't ideal, but we shouldn't disparage it because we get a lot done there. It's one of the most powerful ways to stop human rights violations. When we tried to put on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council China's systematic detention and persecution of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Xi Jinping personally was on the phone calling heads of state, pushing them to vote with China and against us. We lost that effort by 2 votes. It was really close. But it showed how much China cared. Beijing didn't want that condemnation. That's a powerful force for human rights. Now, separately, there's the operational side. And here, it really depends on the integrity of the person. I personally have big problems with both Antonio Guterres and Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, because they refuse to condemn China for its treatment of the Uyghurs. I should say a refusal shared by the Pakistani government, but that's a different matter. But here you have Volker Turk, who is supposed to be the world's foremost defender of human rights, and his 3 years of power, he has never once condemned China for its crimes against humanity against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Its detention of a million Uyghurs to force them to abandon their religion, their culture, and their language. This is an utter abdication of responsibility. It's basic cowardness. And that shows what happens when you have, somebody in a senior position at the UN who is not willing to fulfill their mandate. They have other concerns. And Guterres is even worse. So, I think we do have to be critical of the UN. This is not a perfect institution, but I see no alternative to having, some place where the countries of the world can meet. They sadly are dependent on governmental funding, because what else is there? And we have to just push it, when it's a conference room, push the occupants of the conference room. When it's an operational body, push the leaders to perform better.
Thank you. I think I would now open it to questions, because I can continue, and Ken is can be very articulate and speak about, because about his reflections and his experience of 40 years now of navigating, and in important ways changing how we view international human rights law now. But I can open this up to questions. I imagine people would, to make it more interactive. So if anyone has questions, they should raise their hand, and then if you can get a mic to, I see a hand there, and I see a hand there. Yes, you can make your pick yourself.
I'm Advocate Fatma Hayes from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Speaker of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Youth Assembly as well. I have a question that what is the legal relevance of a United Nations Security Council resolution on Kashmir, and are they still binding? Thank you.
So you'll have to repeat. Is it a question on the United Nations Security Council resolution?
Hold the microphone just closer to your mouth. We had trouble hearing you.
I have a question that what is the legal relevance of United Nations Security Council resolution on Kashmir, and are they still binding? Thank you.
So the United Nations Security Council resolution on Kashmir. Well, we can take a couple of questions and get back to that.
Hello, thank you for a really wonderful discussion. My question is about the ICJ and the credibility of, for example, the decision regarding Netanyahu and all the genocide and the atrocities that are happening, and the ICJ makes a decision, but then there's no enforcement authority. So, how do you see this impacting the impact of the UN when we talk about credibility and
So the lack
hope?
of enforcement of ICJ decision. Do you want to start with this, or should we take a couple of more questions?
Okay. Oh, yeah, okay.
Or do you want
Okay, no, I can go.
this was ICJ.
Yeah. So with the International Court of Justice, as you all know, it is hearing a genocide case against Israel brought by South Africa and now joined by a number of other governments, I think 10 other governments. And I think the question is, what about the lack of enforcement? Because there's been a series of preliminary rulings that Israel has basically ignored. And so the question comes up, how do you enforce an ICJ judgment? And, sadly, the answer is you go to the Security Council, and the US will exercise its veto and protect Israel. So, that traditional route won't work. The alternative is, through various forms of condemnations and sanctions. And we actually have seen, a number of governments curtail their arms sales to Israel. That's a very appropriate response. Sadly, not the United States, which is what matters. Although even Germany has cut back. Israel is clearly desperate to avoid a finding of genocide. And the one complexity we should all be aware of, when I look at this, I say, this is genocide. I've written about this. I've got a long article in The Guardian describing this. But there is a complexity with the ICJ jurisprudence, which is that in a case called Croatia versus Serbia, it said that when you're trying to infer genocidal intent from conduct, you can make that inference only if it's the only possible inference. And that's a crazy decision, because what it means is that if Israel says, our aim in starving Palestinian civilians was not just genocide, but it was also to force them to all flee into Egypt. We had this alternative intent of mass forced deportation, a crime against humanity and a war crime. That becomes a defense to genocide, which is wacko. That can't be. But that's what the law is currently. So the court has to change that ruling. And it will have a chance to do that in the Rohingya case, which is coming up first. Because there it's the exact same thing. The Myanmar army killed, shall we say, 30,000 Rohingya in order to force 730,000 Rohingya to flee into Bangladesh. So there's a dual intent. There was a genocidal intent, and there was a mass forced deportation intent. the deportation should not be a defense to genocide. And I suspect the court will say that and will therefore, when the Gaza case comes forward, also find Israel responsible for genocide. And that ruling will be incredibly powerful. And I think it will be very difficult for governments to continue to sustain Israel despite that genocide. And we're seeing, even in the United States, we're seeing repercussions already. So, Netanyahu the other day gave a speech and he said, we're going to have to wean Israel from US military support over 10 years. Why is he saying that? Because US military support for Israel is becoming increasingly unpopular in the United States. American Jews vote Democratic 80% of the time. 30% of the Jews in New York City just voted for Mamdani. The Christian evangelicals in the United States, who are the real core of Israel's support, even they are souring on Israel because they all watched the genocide unfold. And they don't just say that's okay, they say that's horrible. And so I think that there are repercussions. We can't look to the Security Council, but we can look to popular reaction to gradually detach the world from supporting this genocidal government.
The Canadian Prime Minister, we have recently heard, he has been saying that the rule-based system is not working anymore and the major powers are not supporting us. So we, the middle powers, need to find a new way. What is that new way and how can international order work without the major powers as such?
Yeah, I think, part of what I was trying to demonstrate is we should not be defeatist about the current international system. There are challenges, but also in some ways it's working. But if you say, well, what should we do? I recently published a book called Righting Wrongs, which is what the book is sort of about. And what I stress is that the strength of the international human rights system is not just the laws. Of course we have these treaties, they're important, they give legitimacy to our cause, but the foundation of the defense for human rights is actually the public sense of right and wrong. That's why shaming works. If you spotlight governmental conduct and people look at it and say, that's not so bad, then you can't change it. But if you spotlight it and people are outraged, that's when pressure emerges to force the government to change. And so what all of us have to do is really to pay attention to that public sense of right and wrong. And that is not a given. It can be cultivated, it can change over time, and I think in many ways the most fundamental challenge for the human rights movement is to build and then reinforce the sense that it's wrong for governments to be violating human rights and that they should pay a political price for doing so. I think that's our foremost task.
I've been told that we've gone slightly over time, and we can take one last question. Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. It has been an enlightening debate. We came here in solidarity. We do stand in solidarity with Gaza and Ukraine, but I found a deficit in your presentation. You did skip Kashmir. Is there any reason for that?
Oh, are you saying we skipped Kashmir? Is there a reason for that?
Oh, okay,
no.
Yeah. No, let me address
yes,
Kashmir.
There's no reason for that.
No, obviously what is happening in Kashmir in terms of Indian government repression is very severe. And that needs to be addressed. And it's only, when there's kind of a free Kashmir in terms of the people's ability to speak out and to organize that we can come to some political resolution of that. I describe an incident in my book where Imran Khan, when he was still prime minister, I met with him in New York. And we had a long conversation, and he came to see me about Kashmir. And we had a good conversation about Kashmir, and we all agreed it was terrible. But then I asked him, Kashmir represents, a Muslim minority that is being persecuted, in this case by the Indian state. What about that Muslim minority in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, who are being persecuted by the Chinese state? And he said, I can't talk about that. You know, the Chinese own us. He was at least very honest. You know, I got him to agree to stop apologizing for Beijing, stop defending their treatment of the Uyghurs, so that didn't last. But I think, you know, if you talk to the Pakistani government, yes, we should all be concerned about Kashmir, but the best defense of Kashmir is a principled defense, not one that singles out India, but apologizes for China.
And I'll just add on this. Human Rights Watch has done a lot of work on Kashmir. I don't work on it, but Human Rights Watch has a large body of work on Kashmir for the past 3 decades. And so yeah, Human Rights Watch has a public position on that, but as I said, I work on Pakistan and not on that. But thank you very much for your patience and for your attention. And with this, and we thank Ken for coming to Pakistan, for being part of this conversation. Thank you, and now I think I'm standing between people and their lunch, and I don't want to do that. All right, thank you. Bye.